whatever, what have you, your sin essentially, your desire and your sin aren't things to be vilified necessarily. They're things to be understood. At least this is the way I see it, and at least this is the way that Jung posited it. Because nobody is completely good. No person is expected to be. All saints know they're devils. That's something that Jung says. If anybody thinks that they're going to go without being some part of the yin and the yang, the black paisley with the white dot, or the white paisley with the black dot, unless you're of a certain kind of psychological makeup in terms of being a sociopath or a psychopath, you're not going to be, or an empath, rather extreme biological cases that are fairly rare, you're not ever going to be just one type of person, as there's going to be an amalgamation of traits that exist in you, and a certain range and complex to you that's general across the landscape of the human emotional experience, but that manifests itself in you in particular ways. And I think that the ones, according to Jung, and at least in my own personal experience, that get most manifested with the inferior function are ones of aspirationality, ones of disappointment, ones of resentment, ones of envy, and I think also ones of vilification in whatever way. And so I say that each individual should know their sin. Each individual should listen to their sin, because there's actually useful information in the sin. There's useful information in the darkness. There's useful information in the desire. Why is it that you want that? What is it about yourself that you're not actually realizing or coming to terms with, that you're completely abrogating or ignoring, that's leading to these negative expressions? It's not necessarily that negative emotion is a bad thing. Negative emotion, in some respects, as a natural mechanism, is supposed to be leading you away from pain in some ways. Though I think that our innate reaction to pain is to be completely avoidant of it. Sometimes the avoidancy of pain leads to a mishandling and defranchisation of the self. I think that, at least from my own personal experience, as I'll say this, that I noticed when I was younger, that I would become envious of people who could ingratiate themselves in other people with relative ease. I would be envious not in a very straightforward way. I'd be envious in that way, that I would think that, one, I would pick on or berate people pleasers. I wouldn't have them as friends, and anytime they would complain to me, I would have no sympathy for them, because they're people pleasers, they're dominant extroverted feelers. I would also be resentful to really charismatic guys who could sweep away women in some respects with their presentation, and I would think that they're all presentation. They're all presentation. They don't have substance to them. They don't have depth to them. They won't appreciate someone like me because I have intellectual depth and insight to me, but I don't come with the same sort of dazzling displays and flair of personal characteristics that can excite arousal, elation, and positive feelings in another person. I mean, I can make people kind of feel good in some ways, but I'm not really good at making people feel good. I'll just be honest. That's not one of my strengths. At least not consciously. I don't try to make people feel good. Maybe I do, but I don't really try to. And if I do try, I suck pitifully at it in some ways. But it's just that there are emotions that get associated with it, and if you're like myself, sometimes it's fairly hard for me, not sometimes, most of the time it's fairly hard for me to even know what the hell I feel about anything in the first place. And for me to be able to take these things that are negative, bring them to bear and stare at them, it's rather hard for me to look at my emotions, like stare at them in some respects. I think even the most emotional directed of individuals, it can be hard if we associate those emotions with negative aspects or aspects that are not supposed to be appreciated or prized or valued by whatever societal metric, religious, or whatever. I'm not saying greed is good, but I'm saying greed is useful. And I think that that's the way that Jung would postulate it. Greed is useful. Lust is useful. Violence is useful. They're necessary because we are mammals in some respects. So they're the aspects and inherent causes of some natural drives, but they're also aspects to us as creatures of sociality and relational ability, because you have to want something to be able to go out and achieve results. You have to sit there and have a sexual desire towards a man or a woman in the first place to even think of the kindling of a romantic relationship. In some respects, it's true that that dynamic and that didactic emerges from our first familial and parental relations, but the thing that truly changes the one that we have with a significant other is the aspect of sexuality, or this thing of being generative and creative with that person, as there's always the potential to create a new life. There's a different dynamic, and the sexuality is what changes one relationship from one dynamic to another, very really. And it's just to say that these things are not in of themselves bad, and they're necessary and useful to the equilibrated dynamic that can come with life. If you want to have a vibrant kingdom within self, or within the conscious of oneself, as in everything has an equilibration, that the things that are supposed to be dominant are in the right proportions and balanced with the other things, and the inferior things aren't forgotten, you have to get away from this rather linear and simplistic picture of good and evil. You got to go a little beyond good and evil. You have to go a little beyond good and bad self. And it's like the simple construction or self item that we have in terms of the appraisal of certain things is kind of negative, and where Eastern thought does have some better utility to it, insofar as that good and evil exist in harmony and dynamic with one another. You don't have one without the other. And your shadow, your conscious, yourself, the anima or the animus, they're all interconnected in some way, and your inferior function very really is a piece in that puzzle, as it's going to speak to you. And when I say you got to talk to it and you have to listen to where your negative emotions are coming from, or the things that you may readily associate with negative emotions, and try and figure out why are they there. There's something embedded within the aspirational characteristics. There's something embedded within the characteristics of envy or disappointment or resentment. It's when we completely indulge in disappointment, envy, and resentment, and we completely abrogate the reality that those are things that we can become, or emotions that we can have, is when we get in a lot of trouble. The item of actualization, in a lot of ways, is or the item that can facilitate it, because I'm not saying these things are going to actualize you. What I'm saying is these things are going... Your inferior function is a transformative space that you can exist in, very really. It's the conscious transformative space that you can exist in that won't completely frighten you or destroy you when you try to approach it. In a lot of ways. But that's one way to think about it. You can commune with extroverted feeling if you're an INTP. You can commune with extroverted thinking if you're an INFP. You can commune with these things, and they can lead you to the deeper and the darker aspects of yourself without them totally swallowing you up and being a victim of your psyche in some respects. But it's just that what I mean is this, if that's just sounds too abstract and esoteric, is that if something's kind of unconscious but not completely unconscious, it can be brought up in with associative language. If something is opaque, it can be made clear through petitions, rational efforts, and practices and behaviors. So I guess, for example, in myself, there is something about me that wants to be with communities, but there's something that's rather hard in being with communities for myself, as they seem to be the antithetical agent to a lot of the things that I am. Community does, in a lot of ways. And I do not like groupthink. But I think, though, that I learned that groupthink can have some utility to it. There is a necessity for it, as if you can find the right items of virtue and value, you can propagate those things in a group, and they can take care of themselves as being rather ideas and memes that get spread and lead to proliferation. That's not a novel conception, but I started to realize that if I can make enough people care about the practice of rationality, that maybe group thinking isn't all that bad in some regards, in some respects. It's also to say that I had to realize that the dynamic of my intellectual nature is something that's served towards a community. It's not just for myself. And I don't really take and get a lot of satisfaction from it when it's just completely self-based. I think it's in dialectic oftentimes, and with sharing ideas and with arriving at a conclusion that I know has some utility to it that I really, really appreciate. I don't do it necessarily for other people, and I don't make tools for other people to grasp. It's kind of weird. But at the same time, I know that something's good by the way of its measure and utility. That's just an idea in that way. There are certain aspects. It's just because introverted thinking is tied to the FE, and there's aspects of the way that the function operates in myself that's rather unconscious, but is completely pervasive in the things that I do. And I had to start realizing the why for what it is that I do in some respects. And that's something that's helping me actualize myself, because in some respects, the action or the behaviors only stem from the orientation. It's very much realizing where one needs to go to get one to act a certain way. At least that was in my case. That, I mean, like, so for example, you say you want to develop extroverted feeling, and you think going through speed dating is something that's going to help you. I'm just drawing that is because that's something that I did. That's not really what helps. Now, at least it didn't help me, but now realizing that you're rather disappointed when you can't make your point to people. That's something I had to realize. I'm not necessarily good at explaining things always, and that's one reason why communication troubles me, because I'm articulate, but I'm not always the greatest explainer of things. And people who are good at ingratiating themselves on others are good at presentation, and part of presentation is explanation. And the way that I can get on to that aspirational piece, or that even that envious side of myself, is to try and become a better explainer of content and ideas, and even myself, as I find that I do use the tool of language to present myself to people more so than I do my actions. That's something that this may seem like trivial details and items, but for myself, insofar as equilibrating and tuning things, the more I find these small things that exist in the space of extroverted feeling and tool and tweak and see how they actually fit in the complex of the greater, larger aspects of myself that I tend to ignore, as well as the conscious aspects that I do champion, I'd notice a greater harmony and symmetry within me. Also, the effects of there are benevolent pieces that you may totally ignore and abrogate. It's something I notice with people who are really nihilistic. So nihilistic people, particularly INTPs, nihilistic people tend to experience a lot of negative emotion. And they say they don't value morality and virtuous qualities, but their greatest quips with the world is that people, well, if they're misanthropic in nature in terms of their nihilism, that people are essentially disappointing and are cancerous in some ways and don't deserve to exist. The reason that you have that disposition, despite your ability to realize it or not, is that you're a person who values kindness. You're a person who values altruism, and if the world wasn't barbaric, or if you didn't conceive the world as barbaric, and if you didn't conceive the world as being devoid or making these aspects futile, you would indulge and practice these things and probably express these emotions or these attitudes and sentiments within oneself. I never really liked being kind towards people because there is always the real fact that people can suck in a lot of ways. So I didn't ever really like to express those things, but I'm a fairly kind person. It's just like default in me. And that may be something that's rather more personal. It's very much within these recent years and spaces within myself that I can even express the positive qualities and emotions that come to me by way of my extroverted feeling. And it really is a slow retooling. And honestly, it was the diving into the sin or the desire or the things that we have been made to taught and think are completely bad. I think that there is only human. I don't think that there's good and evil in a lot of ways. I think that there's only human. It's only understanding how it is you're human and what it means to be human and approximating yourself to that picture. Also in the sense that I got a funny relationship with certain aspects of myself, and it's not always necessarily indulging in those things or avoiding those things, but trying to do this toggling relationship as you're having an active communication with them. That's the best way I can say it. It's not that you completely write it off, and it's not that you let it dominate you. It's that you figure out where you stand and where it is you should go given where you stand. What's appropriate given you. And it's not as if those things are easy to figure out. And I'm not giving anybody any sort of gospel or something like that, as any advice I give to somebody always gives the freedom for them to think for themselves and reason about the aspect or the item of information that I present. It's just to say that very really I think in this conception of MBTI that we currently stand with, that behaviorism is rampant and we don't have a true appreciation for our inferior functions. The roles that they can play and the usefulness and the utility and honestly the vitality and generative aspects that exist in them, as they're the anima and they can represent aspects of the divine child that's in oneself. So with all that said, these are my thoughts on the inferior function and its roles to actualization in the individual. Hopefully you found those things useful, and if it was too esoteric and not practical enough for people, well, I give ideas. I don't necessarily tell people what to do. So thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.